In 1345, the King of England owed more money than his kingdom earned in a year. The men he owed it to were not other kings. They commanded no armies. They held no noble titles. They were two families of Florentine cloth merchants who had lent him their entire accumulated fortune. When Edward III stopped paying, the Bardi and Peruzzi families collapsed. Thousands of depositors lost their savings. Florence fell into economic crisis, and Edward III kept his throne, his army, and his wars. He paid no lasting political price. That outcome demands your attention. The creditors lost everything. The debtor lost nothing of permanent consequence. By every visible measure of medieval power, kings had won this story. And yet, over the 3 centuries following this default, merchants across Europe accumulated institutional power, exceeding any single monarchy on the continent. They wrote the legal codes governing international trade. They financed every major war. They built the first banks, the first insurance markets, the first mechanisms of sovereign debt. They did it without armies, without noble blood, and without any blessing from the church. They did it with paper, contracts, and a network of mutual obligation no crown in Europe knew how to match. Welcome to Noob Historian. Behind every headline in your history book, there's a ledger they kept hidden. We open it. To understand how merchants outplayed kings in medieval Europe, you need to understand what power meant in the year 1000 CE. Power in 1000 CE was physical and local. A king controlled territory through military force, through the personal loyalty of his knights, and through the church's endorsement of his right to rule. He collected revenue through land rents, through the produce of his own estates, and through periodic levies on his subjects. He spent those revenues on armies, on buildings, and on the church. The entire economic logic of feudalism ran on land. Land was the source of all wealth. Land produced food, wool, timber, and people obligated to fight when called. A lord controlling more land controlled more of everything. This made warfare the primary economic activity of the medieval ruling class. You seized land, you held land, you defended land. The system was circular and self-reinforcing. Into this world, trade existed at the margins. Local markets sold surplus grain and livestock. Itinerant peddlers moved between villages. A handful of long-distance merchants carried luxury goods for elite buyers. None of this threatened the fundamental logic of feudal power. Kings saw merchants the way they saw craftsmen and farmers, as subjects whose activity generated occasional tax revenues, but who held no meaningful political weight. This assessment turned out to be the most expensive miscalculation in medieval history. The first cracks appeared in the 11th century, and they came from a direction most kings never anticipated. The Crusades, launched in 1096, created an immediate and massive problem for every European ruler choosing to participate. War on the scale of a crusade required money in volumes no feudal revenue system produced quickly enough. Knights needed horses, weapons, food, and transport across hundreds or thousands of miles. Castles needed supply lines. Armies needed pay. Kings looked around for sources of ready cash. They found merchants. The merchants of northern Italy, particularly in Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, had spent the preceding century building commercial networks across the Mediterranean. They moved goods between Muslim and Christian markets at a time when political powers refused to trade directly with each other. They had ships, warehouses, agents in foreign ports, and, most critically, accumulated capital in coin and credit. The first loans to crusading monarchs seemed straightforward. A king needed money. A merchant had money. The merchant lent it, the king agreed to repay, and the transaction closed. A single loan creates a single obligation. Over the next 2 centuries, as warfare became permanent and expensive, royal borrowing became structural. Kings did not borrow once. They borrowed continuously. And this changed everything. A king who borrows once holds the advantage. He takes the money and repays when convenient. A king who borrows continuously, one who depends on merchant credit to maintain his army between harvests, who has already pledged his customs revenues as collateral for loans not yet repaid, this king is not in control of his own fiscal system. The merchant holding his debt is. This transition from occasional borrowing to structural dependency took roughly 2 centuries, from around 1100 to 1300. It happened gradually through thousands of individual transactions. No king woke up one morning and decided to surrender his economic sovereignty to Florentine wool merchants. It happened because war was expensive, harvests were uncertain, and merchants had solved problems of long-distance credit and capital accumulation royal administrations had not begun to address. By 1300, the economic architecture of medieval Europe had quietly shifted. The official hierarchy still placed kings above merchants in every formal sense. The church still condemned lending at interest. The law still defined merchants as a lower order than nobles. But the actual flow of money, credit, and economic decision-making power told a different story. The official story said kings ruled. The ledgers said something else. The tools merchants used to build their parallel financial world were not glamorous. They were not swords or castles or papal bulls. They were contracts. 3 institutional innovations, developed by merchants between roughly 1000 and 1300 CE, created an economic system operating entirely outside royal control. These innovations were the commenda contract, the bill of exchange, and the Lex Mercatoria. Together they formed an infrastructure of trust, credit, and legal enforcement no single king was able to replicate or dismantle. Start with the commenda contract. A commenda was a partnership agreement for maritime trade. One partner, the sedentary investor, provided the capital. The other, the traveling merchant, provided the labor and the voyage. They agreed in advance on how to split profits and losses. When the voyage ended, they settled accounts and the partnership dissolved. This sounds simple, but its implications were transformative. The commenda allowed people with capital but no appetite for travel, landowners, widows, clergy, retired merchants, to invest in trade without leaving home. It spread investment risk across multiple parties. It created a mechanism for accumulating capital from a wide base of small investors and directing it toward large commercial ventures. And it did all of this through private contract, with no royal permission required, no noble intermediary, and no church approval beyond the notary recording the agreement. The earliest surviving commenda contracts appear in Genoa's notarial records from 1154 CE. By 1200, variations of the contract existed across every major trading city in Italy and were spreading to France, Flanders, and the Iberian Peninsula. Historians John Pryor and Abraham Udovich, working from these notarial records, traced how the commenda spread from Byzantine and Islamic commercial practice into European law through direct merchant-to-merchant contact, not through royal decree or church council. The Bill of Exchange came next, and it solved a different problem: the physical movement of money. Moving gold and silver coins between cities in medieval Europe was dangerous, slow, and expensive. Bandits robbed caravans, ships sank, coins were heavy. A merchant carrying large sums of metal coin to a distant fair was a target for every opportunist between departure and destination. The Bill of Exchange eliminated the need to move metal at all. In its basic form, a merchant in Florence gave money to a banker who issued a written order instructing his correspondent in Bruges to pay an equivalent sum in Flemish currency on a future date. The merchant traveled to Bruges, presented the bill, and received payment. No gold crossed the Alps. No coins changed hands between cities. What moved was paper. The Datini Archive in Prato preserves over 150,000 letters and documents from the merchant Francesco di Marco Datini, active between 1363 and 1410. His correspondence reveals a fully developed correspondent banking network stretching from Barcelona to London, from Venice to Bruges, in which bills of exchange circulated continuously, settling debts across borders without physical coin transfers. Datini's agents in 8 cities maintained accounts with each other, netting out obligations periodically and moving only the residual balances in actual metal. This system gave merchants something no king possessed: the ability to move value across borders instantly, invisibly, and without physical exposure. When a king wanted to send money to fund a war in another country, he faced enormous logistical challenges. When a Florentine merchant wanted to transfer the equivalent of 10,000 gold florins from Florence to Paris, he wrote a letter. The Bill of Exchange also created a credit system operating entirely outside royal monetary control. Kings controlled mints. They controlled the official currency. They periodically debased coins by reducing their metal content, effectively taxing everyone holding savings in coin. But bills of exchange operated on merchant creditworthiness and correspondent trust, not on official currency. A merchant whose bills were honored across 6 countries had effectively created a private money system the king's mint had no power over. The third innovation, the Lex Mercatoria, solved the problem of legal enforcement. Medieval legal systems were territorial. Royal courts enforced the king's law within his territory. Church courts handled ecclesiastical matters. Neither was well suited to disputes between merchants from different kingdoms transacting at a fair in a third country. A Genoese merchant claiming a Flemish buyer had defaulted on a contract had no obvious court to approach. Royal courts moved slowly and favored local subjects. Church courts focused on sin, not commerce. Merchants solved this by creating their own legal system. The Lex Mercatoria, or law merchant, was a body of commercial customs and norms developed by merchants themselves and enforced through merchant courts at trading fairs. These courts, called the jurisdiction consulaire in French-speaking territories, operated at every major fair. They were staffed by experienced merchants, applied standardized commercial customs, recognized across borders, and operated with extraordinary speed. A dispute arising Monday morning at a champagne fair received a binding judgment by Wednesday afternoon. The enforcement mechanism was not the king's sword. It was exclusion. A merchant found to have defaulted, acted fraudulently, or violated commercial norms faced expulsion from the fair, reputational destruction in merchant networks across the continent, and blacklisting by correspondents refusing to honor his bills. In a world where your creditworthiness was your most valuable asset, this threat was a far more effective deterrent than the threat of royal punishment. The Lex Mercatoria operated in every country simultaneously. A set of commercial norms developed at the champagne fairs in France applied, with modest local variations, at fairs in England, Flanders, Germany, and Italy. No king created this, no pope endorsed it. Merchants built it themselves from the practical requirements of doing business across political borders, and they maintained it through mutual interest. By 1250, merchants had created a private credit market, a private payment system, a private legal order, and a private information network spanning the entire European continent. The King of France saw all of this only as a dimly understood source of tax revenue. He was profoundly wrong about what he was looking at. The most visible expression of merchant institutional power in medieval Europe was the Champagne fair system, and the records preserved in France's Archives nationales give us a detailed picture of how it worked. The Champagne fairs were 6 annual trade fairs held in 4 towns in the county of Champagne: Troyes, Provence, Bar-sur-Aube, and Lagny. Running in sequence across the year, they functioned as a continuous international marketplace, operating for roughly 10 months out of 12. By 1150, they had become the primary commercial meeting point between Italian merchant bankers from the south and cloth merchants from Flanders, England, and northern France. At peak operation in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the Champagne fairs handled a volume of commercial transactions larger than the annual revenues of the French crown. Italian merchants brought silk, spices, and leather goods north. Flemish and English merchants brought high-quality wool cloth south. The fairs cleared both commodity trades and financial accounts simultaneously, functioning as commodity exchange and international clearinghouse for bills of exchange at the same time. The Counts of Champagne recognized early what they had. The fairs generated enormous tax revenues through market tolls and fees. More importantly, the fairs attracted wealthy merchants needing legal protection, physical security, and reliable infrastructure. The counts obliged. They issued safe conduct letters, the lettres de foire, guaranteeing merchants personal protection while traveling to and from the fairs. They maintained roads, they built warehouses, they funded the fair courts. In exchange, they taxed everything. What the French royal archives reveal is dependency running in both directions. The Counts of Champagne built their prosperity on fair revenues. When the county of Champagne passed to the French crown in 1284 through the marriage of Philip IV, the fairs came with it, and so did the dependency. Philip IV needed money. He always needed money. His wars against England and Flanders consumed revenues his kingdom struggled to generate. The fairs were the most reliable single source of commercial tax income in France, but managing them required giving merchants what they wanted: legal autonomy, physical security, and minimal interference with their private commercial customs. The bargain held barely until 1297. Philip IV expelled foreign merchants from France in 1297 as part of his political conflict with Flemish cities, and in retaliation for what he saw as insufficient English cooperation. The merchant networks responded by rerouting trade. Within 5 years, documented transaction volumes at the Champagne fairs fell sharply. Within a decade, the fairs had lost their position as Europe's primary commercial clearing center to Bruges in Flanders. The shift was permanent. Philip IV demonstrated, without intending to, the exact nature of his relationship with the merchant networks in his territory. He nominally controlled the land. He did not control the trade. When he behaved in ways merchants found sufficiently costly, they moved. And when they moved, his revenues moved with them. This was the structural reality of medieval royal merchant relations. Merchants were not subjects in the conventional sense. They were mobile. Their capital was mobile. Their networks were mobile. A hostile king faced not an armed rebellion, but a quiet redirection of commercial activity toward more hospitable territory. The king lost revenue. The merchants absorbed transition costs and continued operating. The Counts of Champagne had understood this intuitively and built their policy around it. Philip IV understood it only after destroying what his predecessors had carefully maintained. The lesson was written plainly in the royal accounts for any subsequent French king to read. Merchant cooperation was not a given. It had a price. The price was institutional autonomy, legal recognition, and restraint on arbitrary royal interference. Kings paying the price got rich. Kings refusing paid a different kind of price. Across the Channel, the English crown was learning a parallel lesson, and the documentation of it sits in the UK National Archives in 2 extraordinary documents separated by nearly 90 years. The Magna Carta of 1215 is taught in schools as a document about liberty. Clause 41 gets far less attention than Clause 39, but for economic historians, it tells the more important story. Clause 41 reads, in its original Latin formulation, as a guarantee of free movement and fair treatment for foreign merchants throughout England, with freedom from unjust tolls, and with established procedures for their protection during periods of war between England and their home countries. This clause was not a gift from King John to the merchant community. It was a concession extracted by force, or the credible threat of it. The barons forcing the Magna Carta on John did so partly on behalf of commercial interests operating in England as ports and markets. Foreign merchants, particularly Italian bankers and Flemish cloth traders, provided the financial infrastructure on which English commerce ran. Disrupting them disrupted trade revenues the barons also depended on. Clause 41 formalized what prudent practice already required. Merchants needed legal protection guaranteed above the level of royal whim. Edward therefore understood the full implication of this dependency better than his predecessors and chose to monetize it directly. The Carta Mercatoria of 1303 is one of the most explicit transactions in medieval economic history. Edward granted foreign merchants a comprehensive package of legal privileges: the right to trade wholesale anywhere in England, protection from arbitrary seizure of goods, access to fair and speedy legal process, and permission to reside in English towns on equal legal footing with English subjects. In exchange, foreign merchants paid higher customs duties on their goods. Read this carefully, because what it shows is not a king granting privileges out of goodwill. It shows a king selling institutional protection to a community of mobile capital holders whose cooperation he needed more than they needed him. The Carta Mercatoria was a contract. Edward held the nominal sovereignty. The merchants held the money. They negotiated the terms accordingly. Academic historian Wendy Childs, writing on medieval English commercial policy, documented how the foreign merchant community in England used their collective commercial weight to extract successive legal concessions from the English crown over the 13th and 14th centuries. Each concession followed the same pattern: royal financial need, merchant hesitation, negotiated privilege, cash in exchange. The accumulated concessions, by 1300, amounted to a private legal regime operating inside England for a specific class of economic actors. Edward I's Italian banking partners, the Frescobaldi and Riccardi families, provide the clearest illustration of what structural royal debt looked like by the late 13th century. These families did not lend Edward money in individual transactions. They served as his complete financial administrators. They collected English customs revenues on his behalf. They advanced him money against future customs receipts. They managed his accounts in multiple currencies across multiple countries. They held, at any given moment, the financial equivalent of the English government's operating budget in their private ledgers. The Riccardi accounts, partially reconstructed by historian Richard Cooper from English exchequer records and Italian notarial sources, show between 1272 and 1294 the family advanced Edward over £400,000 against English customs revenues they simultaneously administered. They were his banker, his tax collector, and his financial agent at the same time. The arrangement collapsed in 1294 not because Edward paid them back, but because Philip IV of France seized their assets when the two crowns went to war. The Riccardi went bankrupt. Edward found new Italian bankers within months. The system itself was more durable than any individual firm within it. The pattern repeats across every major monarchy in 14th century Europe. The King of France borrowed from Italian families. The King of Naples borrowed from Florentine firms. The Holy Roman Emperor borrowed from banking houses in Augsburg. Every major military operation of the period depended on merchant credit advanced against pledged revenues. Royalty held the titles and the armies. The merchants held the money, and then came Edward III. Edward III of England inherited a kingdom at war and a fiscal system built entirely on foreign merchant credit. To prosecute the 100 Years' War against France, beginning in earnest after 1337, he needed money in volumes the English revenue system alone did not produce. He turned to the two largest banking firms in Florence, the Bardi and the Peruzzi. The numbers preserved in English exchequer records and reconstructed by economic historians Edwin Hunt and James Murray tell the story directly. By 1340, Edward owed the Bardi approximately 900,000 florins and the Peruzzi approximately 600,000 florins. These were not small speculative positions. These were the total accumulated lending of two family firms, representing the savings and investments of hundreds of depositors, investors, and business partners across Italy and beyond. Edward pledged English wool customs as collateral. He pledged future revenues not yet collected. He issued letters patent promising repayment. He did all of this while spending the borrowed money on an army his military campaigns failed to sustain indefinitely without continued French territorial gains. When the military situation deteriorated and English wool exports fell below projected levels, Edward faced a choice between his army and his creditors. He chose his army. In 1345, Edward III formally suspended payments to the Bardi and Peruzzi. He did not negotiate reduced terms. He did not propose a restructuring. He stopped paying with no indication of when or whether he would resume. The Bardi collapsed first. The Peruzzi followed within 2 years. Both families went bankrupt in the technical legal sense of the period, unable to meet their own obligations to depositors who had trusted them with their savings. Giovanni Villani, the Florentine chronicler writing in real time, recorded the impact on Florence as a civic catastrophe. He described the failure of these companies as the ruin of many citizens and the cause of great disorder in the city. Edward III faced no comparable consequence. He kept his throne. He continued his wars. Parliament eventually approved new domestic English wool taxes, providing a partial replacement for the disrupted Italian credit system. Edward lived and reigned for another 35 years after the default. This outcome seems to vindicate every argument for royal supremacy over merchant power. The king defaulted. The merchants died. End of story. But look at what happened next. Within 20 years of the Bardi-Peruzzi collapse, a new generation of Florentine banking firms had rebuilt the Italian merchant credit system and resumed lending to European crowns. The Alberti, the Pazzi, and most famously the Medici picked up the business. They did not abandon sovereign lending out of institutional memory of what Edward had done. They continued because the structural demand for royal credit had not changed, and the profits from successful lending still outweighed the risks of occasional default. More importantly, they adjusted their practices. The Medici, as documented extensively in their own firm records preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Firenze, learned from the Bardi-Peruzzi failure to avoid catastrophic concentration of sovereign credit risk. They diversified. They set informal limits on how much of their capital they exposed to any single royal borrower. They maintained the ability to withdraw credit gradually, rather than hold it all until a single catastrophic default. They treated sovereign lending as one business line among many, not as the foundation of their entire enterprise. The lessons generated by Edward III's default made the merchant credit system more sophisticated, more resilient, and ultimately more powerful, not less. It was precisely in the decades following this collapse, from the 1350s onward, when Francesco di Marco Datini built the commercial network whose records now fill the Archivio di Stato di Prato. Datini was born in Prato in 1335, 10 years before the Bardi-Peruzzi failure. He grew up in the aftermath of the collapse. He became a merchant anyway. The Datini Archive gives you 150,000 letters, account books, bills of exchange, insurance contracts, and partnership agreements from a merchant operating for 50 years across 8 European cities. His correspondence network ran from Florence to London, from Barcelona to Bruges, from Genoa to Avignon. He employed agents writing to him daily about prices, interest rates, political risks, and commercial opportunities in every market he operated in. What the archive shows is not simply one man's business records. It shows a fully operational private financial intelligence network, one processing and transmitting commercial information faster than any royal administration of the period. When the English wool market moved, Datini knew within days. When Flemish cloth prices shifted, his Bruges agent wrote immediately. When political risks in a particular territory rose to a level affecting commercial activity, his agents assessed and reported. Datini himself never lent money to kings at the scale the Bardi had. He read the historical lesson correctly. But his network, and the hundreds of similar networks operated by other Italian merchant firms, constituted an information and capital allocation system of continental scope, sitting entirely outside any royal architecture. The kings of Europe in 1400 were nominally more powerful than ever. They commanded larger armies, ruled larger territories, and had more elaborate court bureaucracies than their predecessors in 1000. But the economic substrate of their power, the credit systems, the payment networks, the legal frameworks for commercial dispute resolution, all of it now ran through private merchant institutions operating under their own norms, their own courts, and their own logic. In Genoa, this dynamic reached its most explicit form. The Casa di San Giorgio, established in 1407, began as a consolidation vehicle for the Genoese state's accumulated debts. The Genoese government owed money to a large number of private creditors, and the Casa pooled these claims into a single institution. The creditors, all of them private merchants and investors, became shareholders. The Casa then administered Genoese government revenues on behalf of its shareholders, collecting taxes, managing state expenditures, and distributing surpluses to shareholders as dividends. The Archivio di Stato di Genova records the Casa's operations in detail. By the mid-15th century, the Casa di San Giorgio had become, in the analysis of historian Stephen Epstein, more stable and more creditworthy than the Genoese government itself. It administered Genoese colonial territories. It funded Genoese military operations. It negotiated on Genoa's behalf with foreign powers. Christopher Columbus, before sailing west in 1492, approached the Casa di San Giorgio for funding. He approached it before approaching the Spanish crown. He knew from the commercial knowledge of his home city, the institution holding real financial power in Genoa was not the government, it was the bankers. Here's the part of this history your textbooks left out. The institutional arrangement medieval merchants built between 1100 and 1400 did not end with the medieval period. It did not get replaced by more modern systems. It evolved into more modern systems. And the core dynamic, private capital holders constraining sovereign decision-making through the credible threat of withdrawal, is the operating logic of global finance today. When economists and financial journalists write about bond vigilantes, they are describing a phenomenon with a documented lineage running back to the Bardi and Peruzzi. Bond vigilantes are institutional investors holding sovereign debt and signaling disapproval of government fiscal policy by selling bonds, driving up borrowing costs for the government in question. When a government announces spending plans its creditors find unsustainable, bond prices fall, interest rates on new government borrowing rise, and the fiscal mathematics of the government's plans change, sometimes dramatically. This is not modern. This is structurally identical to what happened when Genoese merchant creditors refused to roll over the Genoese government as debt, unless the government accepted the oversight arrangements the Casa di San Giorgio would administer. The mechanism is the same. The institutional clothing is different. In 2010 and 2011, the European sovereign debt crisis produced a situation in which the governments of Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and briefly Italy faced borrowing costs their fiscal systems did not sustain. In each case, the constraint did not come from military threat or political invasion. It came from private capital markets withdrawing or threatening to withdraw credit. The governments in question had to negotiate with their creditors and accept conditions attached to continued lending. The International Monetary Fund administered many of these conditions. The Genoese merchant of 1350 would have recognized this arrangement without a single explanation. The International Monetary Fund operates today on a logic similar to the one the Casa di San Giorgio operated in 1430. It pools the lending capacity of member states, lends to governments facing fiscal distress, and attaches conditions requiring recipients to restructure their fiscal and monetary arrangements in ways creditors find sustainable. The conditions are called structural adjustment programs. The Casa di San Giorgio called its equivalent the administration of Genoese government revenues. The names differ. The mechanism of creditor-imposed fiscal discipline does not. The Champagne Fair dynamic, in which mobile capital redirected itself toward more hospitable regulatory environments when one political authority became too costly, now goes by the name capital mobility. Multinational corporations maintain legal entities across dozens of jurisdictions and allocate profits, investment, and operations toward locations where taxation, regulation, and legal frameworks suit their interests. When a country raises taxes above levels firms find acceptable, capital moves toward lower tax jurisdictions. This is not a recent development in economic thought. It is a feature of commercial organization and medieval merchants demonstrated 8 centuries ago. The British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg did not invent offshore finance. The Champagne Fair merchants of 1200 were operating their own version of it when they placed their financial clearing operations in a politically neutral territory governed by rules they had negotiated with the Counts of Champagne. The offshore financial center is a medieval institution wearing a modern suit. Edward Ernst's Carta Mercatoria of 1303, in which he sold legal privileges to foreign merchants in exchange for higher customs duties, has modern counterparts in investment treaties, bilateral trade agreements, and special economic zones. A government negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with a foreign country is performing in legal form the same transaction Edward performed in 1303, exchanging institutional privileges for the capital flows of mobile commercial actors who were able to take their business elsewhere. The historical continuity runs through institutional logic, not through direct organizational descent. Medieval merchant banks did not evolve continuously into Goldman Sachs, but the structural relationship between mobile, private capital, and sovereign political authority, worked out through centuries of documented transactions from the 12th to the 15th centuries, produced the template on which every subsequent iteration of that relationship has operated. You need to understand one more thing about what this history means. The merchants did not outplay kings through superior military force, superior moral authority, or superior legal rights. They outplayed kings through superior institutional design. They built systems for moving information, allocating credit, enforcing contracts, and distributing risk. Those systems were more reliable, faster, and more geographically extensive than anything royal administrations managed to construct. When royal fiscal need brought the two systems into contact, the institutional superiority of the merchant system gradually transferred effective power from the political to the commercial domain. Medieval kings held the sword. Medieval merchants held the ledger. The sword decided individual conflicts. The ledger decided the long-run distribution of power. This is why the Datini Archive matters. Francesco di Marco Datini left behind 150,000 documents from his 50-year career because he ran an organization generating documents, analyzing information, maintaining systematic records, and using those records to make better decisions than his competitors. When he died in 1410, he left his fortune to the poor of Prato. He left his documents to history. The documents are the more valuable inheritance. They show you exactly how the system worked in granular operational detail from the inside. The kings of his era left behind chronicles celebrating their military victories and religious foundations. The merchants left behind account books, correspondence networks, and legal instruments. 4 centuries later, the institutional descendants of the merchants' account books ran the global economy. The institutional descendants of the king's chronicles became the subject of tourism. The evidence supports one conclusion. Economic power in the medieval period did not simply reflect military and political power. It developed its own institutional logic, its own legal order, its own information systems, and its own enforcement mechanisms. This institutional logic was more adaptable, more durable, and ultimately more generative of real-world outcomes than the feudal hierarchy it coexisted with and eventually transformed. The merchants did not outplay kings in a single dramatic confrontation. They outplayed them slowly, structurally, and almost invisibly, through the accumulation of institutional advantages so gradual, no king at any single moment recognized how comprehensively his real decision-making power had been circumscribed. By the time anyone noticed, the ledger had already won. If you want to go deeper on this topic, the Datini Archive has a partial digitized collection through the University of Prato. The UK National Archives holds high-resolution scans of both the Magna Carta and the Carta Mercatoria through their online portal. Iris Origo's biography of Datini, the Merchant of Prato, published in 1957 and still in print, remains the most readable entry point into this world. Edwin Hunt and James Murray's A History of Business in Medieval Europe gives you the broader institutional context. Stephen Epstein's Genoa and the Genoese covers the Casa di San Giorgio in depth. This is Noob Historian. The history they gave you was the version written by the people with the swords. We read the version written by the people with the ledgers.